Newfoundland and Labrador. The vast and largely empty land of the most easterly province in Canada. The same size as France, yet with a population of just 500,000, living mostly in small communities around the coast. To fully appreciate the Catholic sex abuse scandal here, it helps to understand Newfoundland's history and the background of the earliest settlers. Most of the people arrived here from Ireland and the southwest of England in harsh circumstances.
The English sent many fishing vessels over here because there was such a huge stock of cod, and a lot of fishermen from Ireland would come here to try to make a living because they had huge families in Ireland, the Irish Catholics, and there wasn't enough work and enough land and enough industry there to keep them all going. So many of them would come here to fish. However, they'd be rounded up at the end of the fishing season and brought back to Ireland again. And this went on for a number of years, and the law at the time was that if you could stay here for a year and a day on one piece of land, you were free to stay here as a citizen. So a lot of people would run into the woods and camp out all winter long and then stake a claim on a piece of land. And so this community was founded back in the early 1600s as fishermen from Ireland and from England staked claims here and stayed here.
Petty Harbour was typical of the sparsely populated, isolated communities which remained highly religious, Catholics and Anglicans existing side by side without ever mixing.
We used to have, 2 schools, 2 churches, 2 halls, 2 hockey teams, 2 ball teams, 2 of everything. Never played together or grew up together, really. You weren't allowed to do it.
This sharply sectarian, isolated province was the last former British colony to join the Canadian nation. It wasn't until 1949 that it became part of Canada. A devout and God-fearing region, its traditional way of life was disrupted forever by one of the first sexual abuse scandals within the Catholic Church. Though the abuse of boys took place throughout the province from at least the early 1970s, the prosecutions of clergy didn't begin until 1988, with the first and most prominent priest, Jim Hickey. Deanne Fleet and Roger Bill both covered the Catholic sex abuse crisis for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, CBC.
It really started with the Archbishop's nephew. He was a priest living away who just realized he'd been abused by this priest back home, and so many other kids had been abused. And he told a social worker who by chance told the head of the CID, all good Catholics, right? But the head of the CID had heard the rumors back in '79. And I remember him well, a lovely man, looked like a Gary Cooper, an Irish Gary Cooper. Puts his fist in his hand and said, "This time, we'll do it right." And I think that that dominated the views of so many people who were involved in this. That head of the CID flew that priest back to Newfoundland, where he made a complaint against the most powerful priest in the province, the guy who sat on the dais with Diana and Charles, who stood next to the Pope in Flat Rock. And the police officer put in charge of investigating this took it upon himself to go down into a village where this priest, Father Hickey, was, and knock on doors of altar boys. And he brought a female officer with him, and he asked to speak to the boys alone. Usually, police let the victims come to them, right? They don't go looking for victims, but he did. I think by the end of the first night, he had more than 20.
Jim Hickey was the guidance counselor at Brother Rice, which is the largest Catholic high school in St. John's.
boys' school.
Boys' school.
Large.
The boys, they were separate. Girls went to Holy Heart, boys went to Brother Rice. And there was nothing for him to cruise into the classroom, and this young fellow would go with him, and this young fellow would go with him to go help him clean up at the cottage or something like that, right? It was unquestioned. The mother of one of the kids he assaulted, they lived immediately across the street from the church. Her husband passes away. They're in mourning. Hickey comes to the house, said, look, if you want little Jimmy to come over, he's welcome over to the, my place, and when I'm doing things, I'd be glad to take him along, right? Preying on, the widow who thought that he was reaching out to comfort the family in a time of mourning. When Hickey was just preying on this kid, she said to me, he could charm the birds out of the tree. He was so sophisticated. He was so cunning.
Oh, hundreds and hundreds of victims, this guy. Cox said to me he had an enormous sexual appetite, and just...
I interviewed a guy who said he had every day, when he would stay over, they would always have sex. There wasn't a day that Jim Hickey was not having sex. And sex for him was to get the child to lie down, and he would lay between his legs and rub his penis between the kid's legs and ejaculate that way, simulating intercourse. I asked the kid, I said, do you ever talk afterwards? Never. Never. Boys certainly kind of knew what was going on, but nobody was, these were kids.
Hickey and another 2 or 3 priests who were all convicted used to run a summer camp for boys, and there were some priests who wouldn't let their parishioners go.
So they knew.
Well, they knew something. I think people wore blinkers. They were concerned, but they just never went down that road.
I interviewed a group of parents while Hickey was still on trial, and I think the emotion that moved me most and sticks with me most vividly is their sense of betrayal and their sense of they personally failed their children, they failed to protect them.
And there have been suicides and attempted suicides and depressions, and people suffered greatly.
The trials of the clergy in the late 1980s sparked a further wave of prosecutions of lay Christian brothers connected to the Mount Cashel Boys' Home, where abuse had been rife for decades. The brothers taught in Catholic schools throughout Newfoundland. Despite a police investigation in 1975, no charges were brought, which allowed the abuse to continue for a further decade.
So many people were complicit in 1975 in the cover-up at Mount Cashel, and not necessarily that they had specific knowledge, but they were kind of part of that Catholic political power nexus, if you could call it that. They just turned the other way. Nobody went after it.
Judge Hugh said that in his report, that basically the cover-up happened because very high-ranking good Catholics, the chief of police, the deputy minister of justice, and the Christian brothers themselves, they didn't want to do anything that was going to harm the church or bring it into disrepute.
And when it finally did emerge years later, then the media and the police and the criminal justice system kind of wanted to make up for it, I think.
It was a program I was working for. One of the producer at the time had several of us work on a piece about abuse, sexual abuse by clergy. And that night, one of the Mount Cashel boys were watching that. And this was a young fellow who'd been very badly abused, as well as other boys in his family. And he picked up the phone and called the police.
It almost sounds like an accident the way it unraveled.
Right.
But unravel it did.
Right.
And when the kids started to come forward, every time a kid would come forward and go on TV, the police said their phones would ring.
Yes.
With more kids.
Every time I did
Every
a
time.
story. This is one boy. I am 9 years of age, date of birth, August 28th, 1966, and I lives at Mount Cashel Orphanage. I've been at the orphanage for about a year and a half. Ever since I've been at the orphanage, I've been having trouble with Brother English. He feels me up all the time and puts his hand inside my pants. He tells me to play doctor with him. And when I do, he puts my hand inside his pants and makes me play with his bird. He tells me to fool around with the hairs and to move my fingers on his thing. I does this for him because I'm afraid he will hit me if I don't do it. Today, dinner, our brother Kenny called me in a room at the orphanage and questioned me. He asked me if I had any trouble with the brothers, and I told him yes, and that it was Brother English. He told me not to discuss it with anyone. That's a 9-year-old. After all these revelations started coming out, people thought about their own individual responsibility and culpability. During the Mount Cashel inquiry, the Hughes inquiry, there's a little fellow named Johnny who wore what we call a Calgary hat. Those great big Stetsons. And a character, if there ever was one, you know? And he was on the stand telling stories of what had happened to him and abuse and what he'd seen. And one of his stories was about calling one of the Christian brothers a name when he was doing something to another boy. I think it might have been fag, it might have been something else. It was one of the words that are around in the 70s. Anyway, he was a little boy, and he's a little man. He was a little man, he's passed. He was telling a story about he went to school black and blue. A Christian brother beat him severely. Now remember, the schools are run by the Catholic Church, and the school he went to, St. Pius X, was run by a Christian brother, and the brothers also taught it, principal and teachers. So he went to school, and he showed his teachers, you know, how he was so beat up, and nothing was done. Now that was broadcast in the morning. I was there. That afternoon, a teacher, retired teacher, came forward and said, "That's true." He said, "I remember it. I remember his classroom teacher coming to me and saying, what can we do?" And hands were out like this. They did nothing. Principal was a Christian brother.
At one time, a quarter of the priests in the Archdiocese of St. John's was either on trial or in jail. A quarter.
Yeah, we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
This wasn't like one bad apple in the barrel. This was systemic. So, and people were truly shocked. I mean, people were absolutely shocked.
I think overwhelmed. I mean, they just felt it was like a loss of innocence. It was just, people were reeling.
They showed up at public meetings and stood up and talked about the church in a way they never would have ever talked about the church, right? We should stop giving them our money. That's what will get their attention.
Yeah.
The church's PR has gotten much, much better. They've learned how to massage the issue. They seem to be more caring. They seem to be more caring. I don't know if there's any evidence that they are.
I still think that as an institution, one of the primary goals and the prevailing attitude is to protect the institution.